The air at the Henderson County Implement Auction tasted of rust and diesel and something sweeter, the dangerous perfume of easy credit in the summer of 1976. Corn prices held at $3 a bushel. The Russians were buying American grain by the shipload. Every bank in Iowa seemed eager to hand out money with nothing but a handshake and a signature. Men stood in clusters around gleaming red and green machinery, their voices loud with confidence, throwing around figures that would have made their fathers sick with worry. Garrett Hayes stood near the back fence, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his denim coveralls, the fabric worn soft and pale at the knees. At 43, he looked older than his years, face weathered from decades under the Iowa sun, hands scarred from 1,000 repairs, shoulders carrying the weight of knowing things most men his age had forgotten or never learned. His family had worked the same 320 acres of black soil since before the Civil War. His grandfather broke that prairie ground with mules. His father paid it off in 1954, the year Garrett turned 21. The auctioneer's voice rode over the crowd in that hypnotic sing-song pattern, selling off the assets of a man who'd gotten in too deep, too fast. A nearly new International Harvester 1066 with less than 500 hours on the meter went for a price that made Garrett's throat go dry. $38,000. The buyer was Dalton Brennan, of course. Young, loud, confident in the way only a man with nothing to lose could be. Dalton had inherited the farm next to Garrett's 5 years back and immediately mortgaged every acre to buy the 2 sections on his other side. He drove a new Ford pickup with factory air conditioning. He farmed with equipment he traded in every other year, always chasing the latest, biggest, fastest machine. Dalton swaggered through the crowd after winning his bid, clapping neighbors on the back. His voice carried across the yard. "Got to keep up with the times, boys. Get big or get out. You can't make money with museum pieces." His eyes found Garrett for just a moment, a glint of something between pity and contempt in them, before he turned away. Garrett chewed on a stem of wintergreen and watched the auction move forward. They were getting down to the odds and ends now, the forgotten junk pushed to the back fence row. Then they dragged it out, a massive Massey Ferguson 510 combine, one of the first super combines from the late 1960s. It should have been an impressive machine. Wide 18-foot grain head, big Perkins diesel engine, the kind of equipment that could harvest a section of wheat in a day. But this one was a wreck. It had been sitting in a grove of cottonwood trees for years, maybe a decade. The huge tires were cracked and flat, the rubber practically melting into the earth. The once bright red paint had faded to a sick pink in places, peeling away in sheets to reveal a galaxy of orange rust beneath. Birds had built nests in the engine compartment. The cab, just a sun-bleached canvas canopy, hung in tatters. Someone had slapped a magnetic sign on the side for scrap as is. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. "What was old man Henderson thinking with that thing?" someone muttered behind Garrett. "Thing probably seized up the first week he had it." Dalton Brennan's voice cut across the gathering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hell, you'd spend more on diesel just dragging that pile to the scrapyard than you'd get for the metal." The auctioneer, a cousin to the farmer whose life was being liquidated piece by piece, looked embarrassed. All right. Let's get this over with. What am I bid for this agricultural relic?" "Let's start at scrap price." "Who'll give me $500? $500 for the whole works." Silence answered him. The only sound was wind whistling through the empty grain tank. But Garrett wasn't laughing. He walked closer, boots crunching on paint chips and dried mud. He saw past the rust and bird nests. The frame was straight, no cracks, no obvious bends. The final drives looked intact, heavy cast iron housings that would cost thousands to replace if they were broken. He circled the machine slowly, ignoring the snickers from the crowd. The sheet metal was dented and scarred, but it wasn't rusted through in the critical spots. He climbed the ladder, his weight making it groan. Up close, the decay was even worse, mouse droppings, wasp nests, years of accumulated grime. But he peered into the engine bay, and his heart kicked. The block itself, a big inline 6-cylinder Perkins, looked solid. No visible cracks in the casting. The freeze plugs were intact. He knew that engine. It was a torque monster simple enough to rebuild with basic tools. He climbed down and kicked one of the flat tires. The sidewall was hard as concrete, checking badly, but the bead was still sealed to the rim. He walked around to the back, inspecting the chopper and straw walkers. Everything was frozen solid with rust, but nothing had been cannibalized. All the parts were there. 400 then. The auctioneer's voice had taken on a pleading quality. Just to get it off the property. $400, gentlemen. You'll make that back on the tires if you can get them off. Dalton Brennan caught Garrett's eye from across the yard. Thinking of getting a new planter? Hayes. His voice dripped sarcasm. You could probably melt this thing down and make a few hundred row units out of it. His friends howled. Garrett felt heat climb his neck, but it wasn't exactly anger. It was something his father had beaten into him through hard years and harder lessons, a stubborn refusal to let other men tell him what had value. He looked at the auctioneer and cleared his throat. $200. The words fell into the crowd like a stone into still water. Every head turned. The silence was total shocked. Dalton Brennan's jaw actually dropped for a second before snapping shut into a smirk. The auctioneer blinked. I have a bid of $200 from Garrett Hayes. 200. Do I hear 250? Anyone? 225. He looked around desperately. No one moved. They were all staring at Garrett, the crazy man buying the boat anchor. Sold. The gavel came down on his palm with a crack. To Garrett Hayes for $200. Lord help you, son. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering and shaking their heads, Dalton walked over. He stood there for a moment, looking from Garrett to the mountain of scrap iron. You finally lost it, Hayes. That's not farming. That's just stubborn. My equipment's paid for. Dalton shook his head slowly, as if watching a child make a terrible mistake. My new 1066 will pay for itself in one season. You'll spend the whole winter just trying to get that thing to move. And for what? To save a few bucks. My bills are paid, Dalton. The younger man's expression shifted to something almost like genuine concern, which was somehow more insulting than mockery. You're living in the past, Hayes, and the past don't pay the bills in 1976. He walked away back toward his new tractor, leaving Garrett alone with his purchase. The combine sat there in the afternoon heat like a monument to bad decisions, but somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the doubt and the worry about what Lorelei would say, Garrett felt a small spark of something that might have been hope or might have been pure stubborn pride. Getting that Massey Ferguson home turned into a 3-day battle against rust and physics. The first problem was the tires. The valve stems had corroded completely shut, fused into solid lumps of oxidized brass. Garrett spent an entire afternoon with a can of penetrating oil, a wire brush, and a pair of vice grips, working each stem until his hands cramped. The rubber was checked so badly he was certain they'd explode the moment air hit them, but somehow they held. They bulged out in strange shapes, hissing and creaking, but they took pressure from the old PTO-driven air compressor he'd mounted on the back of his 1968 John Deere 4020. The steering was next. The whole system had seized solid. The tie rods looked like they'd been welded directly to the axles by a decade of corrosion. After 2 hours of trying to free them with penetrating oil and heat, Garrett gave up and disconnected the main hydraulic steering cylinder. He chained the front axle straight. The combine would have to be towed like a dead sled. But the worst fight was with the brakes. They were locked up tight as a miser's fist. He crawled underneath with a 5-pound sledgehammer and a steel drift banging on the brake actuators until his arms felt like they were going to fall off. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with the rust dust until he looked like he'd been dipped in red clay. Finally, with a groan that sounded like the earth itself splitting, one wheel broke free. Then the other. He backed his 1965 Chevy C60 grain truck up to the combine, a stout old work truck with a 327 V8 and a 2-speed rear end. He didn't own a trailer big enough for this monster, so towing was the only option. He spent the evening fabricating a tow bar out of heavy channel iron from his scrap pile, bolting it directly to the combine's frame with 1/2-inch grade 8 bolts. It was crude, dangerous, probably illegal, but it was all he had. The 8-mile trip home took most of a day. Lorelei followed in the 4. 020 with the flashers on a small figure in the big tractor's seat, her presence steady, even when he couldn't see her face. Garrett couldn't push the Chevy past 5 miles an hour. The combine swayed and groaned behind him, its immense weight testing the old truck's brakes every time the road dipped. Every farm they passed, men stopped what they were doing to stare. He could feel their judgment like heat on his back. Dalton Brennan came by in his shiny Ford pickup, slowed down, shook his head with that same pitying expression, and accelerated away in a cloud of gravel dust. When Garrett finally pulled into his own lane, the sun was touching the western horizon. He was coated in grease, sweat, and rust, exhausted down to his bones in a way he hadn't felt since his 20s. Lorelei climbed down from the 4020 and walked over with a glass of iced tea, condensation running down the sides. She looked at the massive wreck parked next to the barn, then at him. "Garrett, are you sure about this?" He took a long drink, the cold, sweet tea cutting through the dust in his throat. "I think so. I think there's a good machine in there somewhere." The ladies at church were talking. Her voice was gentle, but he could hear the worry underneath. "They said you were being foolish, that you were letting pride get in the way of good sense. Let them talk. Their husbands are paying 20% interest at the bank. I'm not." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded once and went back to the house. That was Lorelei. She'd voice her concern, but once she saw he was set, she'd stand beside him. The knowing of that made the combine sitting there look a little less impossible. When the first snow fell that November, Garrett began the real work. The barn became both sanctuary and prison during those long winter months. A single bare bulb hung from the rafters, casting harsh shadows across the disassembled combine. He started with the teardown, each step revealing the depth of the machine's decay. The oil he drained from the crankcase came out like black sludge, thick with grit and metal particles. He pulled the injectors one by one, labeling each with masking tape and a grease pencil. Then came the valve cover, the intake manifold, the exhaust manifold, all of it corroded, seized, fighting him every step. The cylinder head was the first major battle. The head bolts were rusted into the block, practically welded by a decade of oxidation. Garrett put a 6-foot length of pipe, a cheater bar, onto his biggest breaker bar and threw his entire weight against it. The bolt didn't even groan. He soaked it in penetrating oil for 2 full days. Then he fired up his cutting torch and heated the block around the bolt until the cast iron glowed cherry red, the heat making the December air shimmer. While it was still hot, he struck the bolt head with a hammer, trying to shock the threads loose. Then he put the pipe back on and pulled again. This time, with a screech that set his teeth on edge and echoed through the barn, the bolt broke free. He repeated the process 17 more times. It took a week just to remove the cylinder head. When he finally lifted the head off with his chainfall, he saw the truth. The exhaust flap had rusted open years ago, probably the first winter the combine sat abandoned. Rain and snow had dripped down the exhaust pipe through the open exhaust valve on cylinder number 5 and pooled there. Over the years, that cylinder wall had turned into a solid mass of pitted rust. The piston was fused to it, welded by corrosion into a single useless lump of iron. The other 5 cylinders were perfect, their walls still showing the crosshatch pattern from the factory hone, protected by a thin film of old oil. Just this one cylinder ruined by a stuck valve and 10 years of weather. He stood there in the cold barn, staring at the ruined cylinder, and felt the weight of his $200 gamble pressing down. The gossip at the co-op had been relentless. "Heard Hayes is trying to unseize that old Massey. More money than sense, that one. Could have bought a decent used Gleaner for what he'll spend on parts." It was week 4 when the drought hit hardest. Garrett sat alone in the barn past midnight, staring at that frozen cylinder. On his workbench sat a dealer catalog he'd picked up in town, used Gleaner combine, $8,500. The bank would probably loan him the money. Everyone was getting loans. Interest rates were still reasonable at 10%. He could be farming with a working machine next harvest instead of gambling on this wreck. His breath made clouds in the frigid air. The house was dark except for the kitchen light Lorelei always left on for him. "Everyone says you're crazy. Maybe they're right." The words formed in his mind, bitter and cold as the December wind rattling the barn doors. Then he thought about his father's last words spoken from a hospital bed in Des Moines 7 years ago. The old man's hands had been thin and spotted with age, but the grip had been strong when he grabbed Garrett's wrist. "Don't let them take this land. Don't ever let a banker own your future." Garrett looked at the catalog for another long moment. Then he closed it, walked to the trash barrel and dropped it in. The next morning before dawn he drove 3 counties over to a salvage yard and found a Perkins engine block from a burned-out industrial generator. He paid cash $200 and hauled it home in the back of his truck. He didn't need the whole block, just the piston and cylinder sleeve from it. In the shop he built a makeshift press using an old hydraulic jack and some I-beams he'd been saving, and carefully pressed the rusted sleeve out of his combine's engine block. The sound it made coming free was like metal screaming a shriek that seemed to carry all the years of decay with it. For weeks after that, he worked with a hone cleaning the bore where the new sleeve would fit, measuring it with micrometers until the dimensions matched the specifications he'd found in a worn shop manual. He cleaned every piston, checked every ring, scraping away carbon with a wire wheel. He ordered a new gasket set from a dealer in Des Moines, paying cash from the coffee can where Lorelei kept the egg money. The loneliness of that work was its own kind of weight. While other farmers gathered at the cafe in town talking about spring planting and comparing notes on new equipment, Garrett was alone in the barn, his hands black with grease, rebuilding an engine that most people considered scrap. The radio kept him company, farm reports and grain prices and weather forecasts, the background music of rural life. Some nights, Lorelei brought dinner out to the barn, a plate covered with a dish towel. She'd sit on an overturned bucket and watch him work, not saying much, just being present. One night in late January, she broke the silence. "I believe in you, Garrett." He looked up from the valve he was lapping, his hands cramped and cold. "Even when I look like the biggest fool in Henderson County, especially then." Her smile was small but genuine. "Because you're my fool." Those moments kept him going when the work seemed endless and the outcome uncertain. The engine came back together piece by labeled piece, slowly transforming from scattered parts into something whole again. He rebuilt the starter motor, rewinding the armature by hand. He spliced in new wiring where the old had been chewed through by mice. He replaced every fuel line with new rubber hose. But the biggest job was still ahead. The 18-foot grain head was too wide for his terraced fields. It would hang over the edges, impossible to maneuver. So he bought 2 old 10-foot John Deere grain heads at another auction for $50 each. In his shop, he cut them apart with a cutting torch, the flame hissing as it sliced through steel sparks cascading onto the concrete floor. He laid out the pieces like a giant jigsaw puzzle, measuring and calculating. Using his Lincoln stick welder, he began fabricating a single 13-foot rigid header, the perfect size for his operation. The work was slow and precise. Each weld had to be perfect, each brace properly positioned. He reinforced the frame with additional steel, rebuilt the sickle bar drive mechanism, and adapted the mounting plates to fit the Massey Ferguson's feeder house. It cost him nothing but time, welding rods, and electricity. And patience. Endless grinding patience. By early June, the combine was whole again. The engine, freshly painted Perkins green, gleamed under the barn lights. The custom-built header was mounted and tested, the sickle bar running smooth. He'd replaced both batteries, filled the fuel tank with fresh diesel, and bled the fuel system 3 times to make sure no air remained in the lines. The morning he decided to start it, Garrett stood in the barn doorway watching the sun come up. His hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion or nervousness, he wasn't sure which. 9 months of work had led to this moment. 9 months of doubt and frozen fingers and quiet determination. He climbed into the operator's seat, the worn steel still cold from the night. The key was stiff in the ignition. He took a deep breath and turned it. The starter groaned, turning the big 6-cylinder engine over slowly, laboriously. Once. Twice. The compression was tremendous, the resistance almost more than the starter could handle. On the 3rd revolution, a puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack. On the 4th, another. The engine was trying. He reached for the ether bottle, just a quick shot to help it along. One more turn, and then it happened. With a roar that shook dust from the rafters, the Perkins diesel fired. It sputtered and coughed, belching a thick cloud of black smoke and rust flakes that had been hiding in the exhaust system. Then it settled into a rough, hammering idle, the sound of 6 pistons driving 6 connecting rods, the music of controlled explosion and precision engineering. Garrett sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, trembling. It was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard, not because it was smooth or quiet, but because it was proof. Proof that he'd been right to look past the rust. Proof that invisible work had value. Proof that sometimes the things everyone else calls junk still have life in them. He let it run for 20 minutes, watching the temperature gauge climb, listening for any strange knocks or rattles. The engine ran rough at first, then smoothed out as the cylinders heated and the rings seated. When he finally shut it down, the silence that followed felt somehow fuller than before. Outside he heard voices. Wyatt came running from the house, 9 years old now, growing tall like his grandfather had been with Lorelei behind him. "Dad, it works. Does it really work?" Garrett climbed down his legs, unsteady. "It does, son. It really does." Lorelei stood in the barn doorway, the morning sun behind her, making a halo of her hair. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I never doubted." "Yes, you did. I saw it in your eyes sometimes." "Okay, yes. But I trusted anyway. That's called faith." He wanted to say something about love, about partnership, about how her quiet presence had kept him sane through the long winter. But a truck engine interrupted Dalton Brennan's Ford, slowing on the road. Through the barn door, Garrett watched him stop, saw the young man's face as he realized the combine was running, saw his expression tighten before he accelerated away. Garrett Hayes had spent $200 in 9 months of his life bringing a dead machine back from scrap. He'd done it alone in a cold barn while the world outside moved forward without him. He'd been mocked and pitied and dismissed as a fool living in the past. But standing there with his family, listening to the tick of cooling metal, smelling the diesel smoke that still hung in the morning air, he knew something the mockers didn't. The future everyone was chasing on credit and promises that future had a price tag attached, and someday somehow that bill would come due. When it did, the man with no debt and a machine he'd rebuilt with his own 2 hands would still be standing. He just didn't know yet how soon that day would arrive or how terrible the reckoning would be. By the spring of 1978, the Massey Ferguson had proven itself through a full harvest season. The custom header had cut clean, the rebuilt Perkins had run strong, and Garrett's bins had filled with good grain sold at peak prices. But around him, the boom was accelerating into something that felt dangerous. Grain prices stayed high through 1978 and into 1979. Land values doubled, then doubled again. Farms that had sold for $800 an acre in 1970 were bringing $3,000 by 1979. The Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Boots, was on the radio constantly: plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. American agriculture is feeding the world. At the diner in town, the conversation had shifted. Men no longer talked about the weather or their crops. They talked about interest rates and expansion strategies and tax implications. They spoke in abbreviations: LTV ratios, ROI, leverage multipliers. Farming had become a business, and businesses needed to grow. Dalton Brennan was the poster child for this new era. By the spring of 1979, he was farming over 1,000 acres. He'd bought the Peterson place as planned, then added another 80 acres in the fall. His operation was a gleaming testament to modern leveraged agriculture. He ran 2 full-time hired hands. His wife Charlene drove a new Chevrolet station wagon. On Sundays at church, he wore clothes that came from department stores in Des Moines, not from the Sears catalog. One afternoon that spring, Dalton stopped by Garrett's farm. His truck idled in the lane, air conditioning humming. Garrett was in the yard rebuilding the clutch on his old Farmall M, the 1951 tractor his father had bought new. His hands were black with grease, his coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid. "Still playing with that old junk, I see." Dalton's voice carried over the diesel rumble of his truck. "You know, I just locked in a forward contract on my fall corn. The price is going to pay the note on my new 4-wheel drive in 1 year." 1 year, Garrett. Garrett wiped his hands on a rag, not looking up from his work. "I'm doing all right, Dalton." "Are you?" The question had a sharp edge hidden under false concern. "You're farming the same 320 acres your granddaddy farmed. My operation will clear more profit this year than this whole place is worth. There's a new world out here, Hayes, and you're still living by the old rules. My rules keep me sleeping at night." Dalton laughed, but there was an uncertain quality to it. "Well, I sleep fine, too, in a house with central air and a new roof. You think about that." After he drove away, Garrett stood in the yard holding the greasy clutch plate. Inside the house he could hear Lorelei moving around in the kitchen starting supper. Wyatt was in the barn doing his chores. The boy was 11, now old enough to handle real responsibility. The 320 acres stretched around them in every direction, every inch paid for, every acre free and clear. That evening after supper, Wyatt asked a question that had clearly been building for a while. "Dad, why don't we get new stuff like Mr. Brennan?" Garrett set down his coffee cup. "Because new stuff costs money we'd have to borrow. And borrowed money has to be paid back with interest. But Mr. Brennan seems to be doing okay." Seems to be. The words hung in the air between them. Garrett met his son's eyes. "Let me show you something." He led Wyatt to his small office off the kitchen, pulled out the farm ledger. "See this column? Pages of profit with no bank taking a cut. That means every dollar we make is ours to keep. No dealer gets monthly payments. When the crop fails or prices drop, we might have a tough year. But we don't lose the farm." Wyatt studied the numbers with a child's simple understanding, but he could see the logic. What if Mr. Brennan has a tough year? Then Mr. Brennan has a problem. Garrett closed the ledger. "Remember this, son. The land will take care of you if you take care of it. But the minute you start working for the bank instead of yourself, you've lost something you can't get back." By late 1979, the warning signs were there for anyone who cared to look. Paul Volcker had taken over as chairman of the Federal Reserve in August, and his language was different from his predecessors. He talked about inflation as if it were a disease that needed aggressive treatment. He talked about cooling down an overheated economy. The farm report on the radio started including mentions of prime rates and monetary policy. Most farmers ignored it. Corn was still bringing good prices. Land values were still climbing. The tractors in the dealer lots were still shiny and new and available with easy financing. But Garrett heard it, and he saw it in Frank Morrison's face every time he went to the bank. On an evening in November, Garrett drove to Dalton's place. He'd thought about it for weeks, composing arguments in his head while he worked. The sun was setting when he pulled into the yard. Dalton was in his shop, a new metal building with concrete floors and overhead lights that could have served as an operating room. He was doing maintenance on his Steiger four-wheel drive, a massive articulated tractor that looked more like something from a construction site than a farm. "Hayes, didn't expect to see you here." Dalton straightened up from under the hood, wiping his hands on a shop towel that was cleaner than most of Garrett's clothes. "Just wanted to talk for a minute." Garrett stayed by his truck, suddenly uncertain. "Interest rates are climbing, Dalton. Volcker's talking about fighting inflation. If they keep raising rates and corn prices drop, that's a lot of ifs." Dalton's tone was defensive now, the easy confidence cracking slightly. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I know what I'm doing. I've got forward contracts. I've got crop insurance. This is modern agriculture, Hayes. We use leverage to grow. That's how it works now. Just be careful. That's all I came to say. I am being careful. I'm carefully building an operation that'll still be here when yours is just a historical footnote." Dalton turned back to his tractor. "Thanks for stopping by." Garrett drove home in the dark, knowing he'd done what he could and knowing it hadn't been enough. You couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. You couldn't make a man see danger when he was convinced he was invincible. The summer of 1980 arrived with a cruelty that seemed biblical. By the first week of May, the rain stopped. It simply stopped, as if some cosmic valve had been shut off. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way for months. June came with temperatures that broke records. July was worse. Garrett's corn, which should have been knee-high by the 4th of July, struggled to reach his waist. The leaves curled tight like rolled cigars, a defense mechanism against the relentless sun. The deep black soil that had always held moisture so well cracked open in geometric patterns, fissures deep enough to swallow a man's boot. Every morning Garrett walked to the edge of his porch and looked at the sky. Every morning it was the same pitiless white haze. The knot in his stomach grew tighter each day. A drought didn't care whether your machinery was new or old, whether you had debt or were free and clear. It starved everyone the same. But debt made starvation fatal. The heat was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on the land and squeezed the life out of it. Cicadas buzzed from morning until night, a constant high-pitched drone that sounded like the earth itself screaming. At the co-op, men who'd bragged about their projected yields in the spring now stood in sullen silence, staring at the heat shimmering off the asphalt parking lot. The news from the Federal Reserve was somehow even hotter than the weather. Interest rates weren't just climbing, they were soaring. The prime rate hit 15% in June. By August, it was at 18%. The numbers were so abstract, so impossibly high that most farmers just shook their heads. They'd signed their loans when rates were 10 or 12%. Many had variable rate agreements assuming rates would come back down. They hadn't imagined this. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-July, Garrett was trying to cultivate what was left of his corn, scraping at the stubborn weeds that seemed to thrive in the heat that killed everything else, when he saw trouble at Dalton's place. The massive Steiger four-wheel drive sat motionless in the middle of a field, a plume of black smoke frozen against the white sky like an exclamation point. Within 20 minutes, the dealer's service truck came racing down the gravel road, throwing up a dust cloud visible for miles. Two men in clean uniforms worked on the tractor for hours, their movements increasingly frantic under the punishing sun. Garrett watched from the seat of his FarmLife, the old tractor's engine popping its steady, reliable rhythm, and felt a sick certainty about what was happening over there. That evening he saw Dalton at the gas station in town. The younger man looked like he'd aged a decade since spring. His face was pale under his tan eyes, shot through with red veins, shoulders slumped. He was moving like a man carrying an invisible weight. What happened to the Steiger Dalton kicked at a loose piece of gravel? Hydraulic pump went out. Took the whole planetary gear set on the right side with it. Dealer says it's a factory defect, but of course we're 3 months out of warranty. He let out a laugh that had nothing to do with humor. They flew the parts in from Fargo. You know what that bill came to? $12,000. For a part that shouldn't have failed in the first place. $12,000. The number hung in the air between them. It was more than Garrett had paid for his John Deere 402, his Chevy grain truck, and the Massey Ferguson combine combined. More than some men made in a year. Dalton's voice cracked slightly. And the fuel. Diesel's over $1 a gallon now. That thing burns 30 gallons an hour under a heavy load. It's eating me alive, Hayes. Just eating me alive. He looked at Garrett's old Ford pickup, faded blue paint and rust spots, 200,000 miles on the odometer. How do you do it? How do you make it work with this old junk? My costs are low. When something breaks, the part I need is usually sitting in a salvage yard somewhere waiting for me to find it. Dalton just shook his head and walked to his truck. When he drove away, the swagger that had defined him for 5 years was completely gone. All that was left was a man standing on a trapdoor, finally feeling the hinges start to give way beneath his feet. The harvest that fall was catastrophic. Yields were cut in half across the county. Garrett's fields, which normally produced 130 bushels per acre, struggled to make 65. But because he had no debt, it was a bad year, not a killing blow. He could absorb the loss, tighten his belt, and survive. For Dalton, the mathematics were brutal and inescapable. His entire operation had been built on the assumption of good yields and stable prices. He got neither. The Carter administration's grain embargo on the Soviet Union had cratered the export market. Corn that should have brought $4 a bushel was struggling to fetch $2.50. Dalton had massive payments coming due, payments calculated on the assumption of bumper crops at premium prices. Instead, he had half a crop at Depression-era prices, and the interest on his loans had ballooned to 20%. Garrett saw him one morning at the grain elevator arguing with the manager. Dalton's face was flushed with anger and desperation, his voice rising as he tried to negotiate an advance against his stored grain. But the manager was shaking his head. The bank held the lien on Dalton's crop. They weren't releasing a dime until their note was satisfied. Dalton caught sight of Garrett watching and stormed out of the building, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. The man who had seemed larger than life just 3 years ago now looked small and trapped. All that gleaming equipment that had been his symbol of success had become a fleet of iron anchors dragging him under. At church the following Sunday, Garrett noticed Charlene Brennan sitting with her children, but without Dalton. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. She wore a dress Garrett recognized from 2 years ago. After the service, Lorelei went to speak with her, but Charlene just shook her head and hurried to her car. Through the window, Garrett saw her sit in the driver's seat for several minutes before starting the engine, her shoulders shaking. The winter of 1980 to 81 was the quietest, most desperate time Garrett could remember. It felt like living through a plague, invisible but deadly, sweeping across the heartland in absolute silence. There were no headlines, no dramatic news reports, just certified letters from banks arriving in rural mailboxes, just grim-faced men from the sheriff's office posting foreclosure notices on barn doors. The newspaper's classified section grew thick with farm auction notices. Farms that had been in families for 100 years survived the Depression, and 2 world wars were going on the block. The plague didn't discriminate. Good farmers and bad farmers, young and old, careful and reckless. If you had debt when the bottom fell out, you were in trouble. Land prices, which had seemed unstoppable in their climb, suddenly stalled. Then they began to fall. By January, farms that had sold for $3,000 an acre in 1979 were struggling to bring $1,500. The collapse was feeding itself. Desperate farmers trying to sell, no buyers with cash or credit to purchase values plummeting, banks foreclosing, more desperate sellers flooding the market. At the co-op, the paranoia was palpable. Men avoided eye contact. Conversations died when someone new approached. Everyone wondered who would be next. The feed store owner had started requiring cash payment. The implement dealer had laid off half his mechanics. Even the diner seemed quieter, as if people were afraid that speaking their fears out loud would make them real. Garrett felt a strange mixture of emotions he didn't fully understand. Relief that he'd been spared. Guilt that his relief felt like gloating. Sadness at watching neighbors and friends lose everything. Anger at a system that had encouraged, no, demanded the very behavior that was now destroying people. In church, the pastor prayed for those facing difficulties. Everyone knew who he meant. You could see it in the faces of the congregation, half of them underwater on debt, half of them trying not to show their relief at being spared. Lorelei reached over and took Garrett's hand during the prayer. Her grip was tight, almost painful. At home that evening, she spoke the words he'd been thinking. I feel guilty. We're okay, and so many aren't. We prepared. We chose differently. That's not luck. But what if we'd needed to expand? What if our land wasn't enough to support us? Would we have borrowed too? Garrett considered the question honestly. Maybe. I don't know. But my father drilled into me the fear of debt, literally beat it into me with work and worry. Maybe that fear saved us. Or maybe we just got lucky with timing. She leaned against him on the old sofa. Whatever it was, I'm grateful. In late March, Dalton came to Garrett's place. It was after dark, which was unusual enough. But what struck Garrett most was how Dalton moved slowly, like an old man, like someone who'd given up fighting. He got out of his truck and stood in the yard, not approaching the house, just standing there. Garrett walked out to meet him. The spring air was cold, carrying the scent of thawing earth. They're taking it all. Dalton's voice was flat, emptied of emotion. Everything. Auction set for Saturday the 18th. A long silence stretched between them. In the distance, a train whistle sounded long and mournful. You were right. About all of it. Dalton's laugh was bitter as acid. I thought I was building an empire. Turns out I was just building a house of cards, and the wind finally came. I'm sorry. Are you? I spent 5 years mocking you. Called you a fool, a relic, a dinosaur living in the past. And you're still standing, still have your farm, still have your dignity. There's no victory in this, Dalton. Watching you lose everything doesn't make me feel vindicated. It just makes me sad. Charlene's family is taking her and the kids. She's leaving me, says she can't watch me drown anymore, and I don't blame her." Dalton's voice cracked on the last words. Garrett's chest tightened. Words felt inadequate, useless. He put a hand on Dalton's shoulder and felt the younger man trembling. "I don't know why I came here. Maybe to say you were right. Maybe to say goodbye. You're going to survive this. It's not the end. Feels like it." After Dalton drove away, taillights disappearing into the dark, Garrett stood in the yard for a long time. The stars were clear and cold overhead, infinite and indifferent. Inside the house, Lorelei was waiting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee for him. "He's broken." She nodded. "Then we help him. When the time comes, we help him." Garrett looked at her across the table. This woman who'd stood beside him through all of it, who'd trusted his judgment even when it looked like foolishness, who'd scraped together egg money to help buy engine parts. "How, I don't know yet. But we'll figure it out." Her eyes were clear, certain. "Because that's what neighbors do. That's what it means to be human." That night Garrett couldn't sleep. He went to his office and pulled out his ledger, the farm's financial records going back 20 years. He calculated what they had savings accumulated slowly, painfully over decades of modest living. He calculated what Dalton's land was worth now in this collapsed market. He calculated what they could afford without borrowing a single dollar. The numbers were there. Barely, but they were there. He thought about his father's deathbed words, "Don't let them take this land." But his father had also taught him another lesson, demonstrated rather than spoken. A man's worth wasn't measured in acres, but in how he treated his neighbors when they fell. Saturday the 18th dawned cold and gray, a raw April wind whipping across Henderson County. Garrett and Lorelei drove to the auction together, Wyatt in the back seat. The boy was 13 now, old enough to understand what he was witnessing, old enough to remember. The yard at Dalton's farm was packed with vehicles. The crowd was a mirror image of the one Garrett had stood in nearly 5 years earlier. But everything had changed. The faces were the same, but the confidence had been replaced by fear and morbid curiosity. They'd come to see the king fall. They'd come to wonder who would be next. Dalton's equipment was lined up in perfect rows, just as it always had been. The big International Harvester 1486. The Steiger four-wheel drive. The 1460 axial flow combine. In the sunlight they still looked powerful, invincible. But everyone there knew the truth. They were monuments to a broken dream, expensive tombstones marking the death of an illusion. The auctioneer's voice lacked its usual energy. He wasn't selling opportunity. He was liquidating failure. The bidding was sparse, the prices brutally low. A tractor that had cost Dalton $80,000 2 years earlier sold for $30,000. The market was flooded with used equipment from other failed farms. Nobody had the cash or credit to pay fair value. Garrett watched Dalton standing by his house, Charlene's arm linked through his. So she'd come back at least for this, or maybe she'd never actually left. The rumors in a small town were often more dramatic than reality. Dalton's face was a mask of disbelief, watching his entire world being sold piece by piece for pennies on the dollar. The crowd thinned as the big machinery sold off. But Garrett stayed. He watched them sell Dalton's tools, his welding equipment, his air compressor, his socket sets and torque wrenches and specialty tools accumulated over years. These were the things a man used to build his life with, and they were being scattered to strangers. Lorelei stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She knew what he was thinking. She'd known since the night Dalton came to their house. Finally, the auctioneer moved to the land itself. They started with the parcels Dalton had bought, last the expensive ground he'd leveraged everything to acquire. It sold for less than half what he'd paid. With each lot that went, Garrett could see Dalton flinch as if being struck. Then they came to the last piece. The original 160 acres that Dalton's father had left him. The home place. The house where he'd grown up, where his children had been born. The barn his grandfather had helped build. "All right, folks. The auctioneer's voice was tired, drained. "This is the last parcel, the home quarter with house and buildings. Let's start the bidding at $25,000. Charlene buried her face against Dalton's shoulder. This was the final cut, the last piece of dignity being stripped away. The bidding was slow. A few neighbors made half-hearted offers, but their hearts weren't in it. Then a man in a clean suit stepped forward, a land investor from Des Moines, a vulture come to pick the bones. He started bidding with the cold calculation of someone who saw only numbers, not lives. The price crept up slowly. A neighbor would bid, the city man would counter, back and forth. But it was still a fraction of what the land was worth, still a bargain built on tragedy. The neighbors dropped out one by one, unable to compete, unwilling to profit from disaster. Going once. The auctioneer looked around with what might have been hope or might have been exhaustion. Going twice. Garrett looked at Dalton. The younger man's head was down, his shoulders slumped. He'd lost everything, the equipment, the expansion ground, and now the home place. The man who'd mocked museum pieces and old-fashioned thinking was being erased from the land entirely. There was no triumph in it, no satisfaction, just tragedy. Garrett took a breath and his voice cut across the yard. "I'll bid $30,000. Every head turned. The crowd went silent. The city investor's face darkened with annoyance. The auctioneer's eyes widened. $30,000 from Garrett Hayes. "Do I hear 35? The investor bid. Garrett countered. They went back and forth, the numbers climbing. Garrett wasn't thinking about price per acre or return on investment. He was thinking about Dalton's face, about Charlene's tears, about what his father would do, about what kind of man he wanted to be. He knew his finances down to the penny. 10 years of living modestly while others lived large. 10 years of saving while others spent. 10 years of repairing while others replaced. He had $180,000 in the bank. While Dalton had been spending $200,000 on equipment, Garrett had been putting $15,000 to $20,000 a year into savings. The investor bid again. Garrett countered. The price climbed past what the land was worth in the current market. The investor shook his head and waved his hand in disgust. He was out. Sold. The auctioneer's gavel came down. To Garrett Hayes for $42,000. A murmur went through the crowd, low and uncertain. Garrett Hayes, the man everyone had pitied for his old equipment and small operation, had just bought his biggest rival's home. The story would be told in the county for years, but nobody yet knew how it would end. After the crowd began to disperse, vehicles kicking up dust as they left, Garrett walked across the yard toward Dalton. The younger man sat on the porch steps of the house that was no longer his, still wearing the same clothes from that morning, but looking like he'd aged another decade in the hours between. Charlene stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself against the cold wind. Garrett's boots crunched on gravel. Dalton didn't look up, just stared at his own hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I'm sorry, Dalton." The words seemed to reach him from a great distance. Dalton finally raised his head, and his eyes were empty in a way that made Garrett's chest constrict. "You won, Hayes. You were right all along. I was a fool." Garrett lowered himself onto the step beside him. The wood was cold through his jeans. "No, you weren't a fool. You just believed the song everyone was singing. It was a good song for a while." "A good song." Dalton's laugh was sharp and broken. "Yeah, right up until the music stopped and I was the only one still dancing." From his jacket pocket, Garrett pulled out a folded piece of paper. Lorelei had typed it on their old Underwood the night before, her fingers precise on the keys while he dictated the terms. He unfolded it now, the paper crisp and white in the gray afternoon light. "I need someone to farm this place for me. I'm getting too old to handle another 160 acres by myself." He held it out. Dalton stared at it without taking it, without moving. "I'll rent it to you for $1 a year. You and your family can stay in the house. No other conditions." Dalton's hands trembled as he finally took the paper. His eyes moved across the words, but Garrett wasn't sure he was actually reading them. The silence stretched so long that Garrett wondered if Dalton had heard him at all. "Why?" The word came out barely above a whisper. "After everything I said to you, after I laughed at you, called you a dinosaur, told everyone you were wasting your life, because that's what neighbors do. Dalton tried to speak, but no sound came. His throat worked, his jaw clenched, and then a tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Then another. He looked down at the paper in his hands as if it were something precious and fragile, as if it might disappear if he held it too tight. "And your tools." Garrett gestured toward his truck. "I bought your welder and your good socket set. They're in the back. They're on loan. You come get them whenever you need them." This time Dalton did try to speak, and the words came out jagged. "I'll pay you back. Somehow. I don't know how, but I will. Just farm it well. That's all the payment I need." Charlene moved, then crossing the distance between them in 3 quick steps. She wrapped her arms around Garrett's shoulders, her face pressed against his neck, and he could feel her shaking with sobs she'd been holding back for months. "Thank you." The words were muffled but fierce. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." When she finally stepped back, her eyes were red but clear. "We're staying, together." She looked at Dalton. "We're going to get through this, together." Across the yard, Garrett saw Lorelei standing by their truck with Wyatt. She met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod. He'd done what they'd discussed. He'd done what felt right even when the numbers said it was risky. He'd chosen compassion over calculation, and the look on her face told him she was proud. The story of what happened that April afternoon spread through Henderson County like fire through dry grass. It changed overnight, transformed in the telling until it became something larger than the facts alone could support. But the core remained true. Garrett Hayes had bought his fallen rival's home place and given it back. Not sold it, not rented it at market rate, given it back for $1 a year in a handshake. At the co-op the following week, conversations stopped when Garrett walked in. Men who'd ignored him for years now nodded with something that looked like respect. At church on Sunday, the pastor mentioned the act carefully without names as an example of Christian charity. People who'd pitied Garrett for his old equipment and small operation now saw something different. They saw wisdom where they'd seen stubbornness. They saw strength where they'd seen weakness. The shift wasn't universal. Some still thought he was a fool, just a different kind of fool now. Some resented him for having the resources to help when they barely had enough to survive themselves. But most recognized what he'd done as something rare mercy extended without conditions grace offered, without expecting anything in return. Dalton moved through those first months like a man recovering from a serious illness. He worked the land Garrett had given him with a carefulness that bordered on reverence. Every morning before dawn he'd walk the fields, checking soil moisture, inspecting drainage tiles, pulling the occasional weed by hand. He farmed the way his grandfather had farmed, the way men farmed, when they understood land was a privilege, not a right. In the evenings he worked in the old shed behind the house, the one his father had used for machinery repairs. He'd taken Garrett's tools, borrowed not given, and set up a small engine repair business. Word got around fast. Dalton Brennan could fix anything. Small engines, hydraulics, electrical systems. He charged fair prices, did the work right, and stood behind it. The first customer was a widow from 3 farms over whose riding mower had quit. Dalton rebuilt the carburetor, replaced the fuel lines, and charged her $20. She tried to give him $40. He refused. The next customer was a young farmer whose diesel pickup had developed a fuel injection problem. Dalton diagnosed it in 20 minutes, ordered the part, installed it himself, and charged only for the part plus 2 hours labor. The young man asked why it was so cheap. Dalton just looked at him and said he knew what it was like to count every dollar. By the fall of 1982, Dalton had more work than he could handle alone. He hired a kid fresh out of technical school, taught him the trade the old way through watching and doing and making mistakes and learning from them. The business grew slowly, organically, built on reputation rather than advertising. Garrett would stop by sometimes in the evenings, finding Dalton under the hood of someone's truck or hunched over a small engine on the workbench. They'd talk about crops and weather and machinery the way neighbors had talked for generations before credit and expansion and leverage had turned farming into finance. Neither man mentioned the auction or the lease agreement or what had been lost and given back. It existed between them as a fact acknowledged, but not discussed, the foundation of a friendship neither had expected. In the spring of 1986, Dalton came to Garrett's place on a Sunday afternoon. He was driving a different truck now, a used Ford he'd bought for cash, 15 years old, but mechanically sound. He got out slowly, walked to where Garrett was doing maintenance on the Massey Ferguson, and stood there for a moment before speaking. "I've got money saved up. 5 years of living careful. 5 years of building the business. I want to buy 40 acres from you. From the home place. I want to buy it back." Garrett set down the wrench he'd been holding. "How much have you got? 40,000 cash?" It was too much. Even in the recovering market, 40 acres was worth maybe 30. Garrett started to speak, but Dalton held up a hand. "I know it's over market. I don't care. I need to own something again. I need to own part of what my father left me. Not for pride. For my kids. So they know we came back from nothing." Garrett wiped his hands on a rag. "All right. We'll draw up papers. Make it legal." They shook hands there in the yard, the deal sealed the old way on character and mutual respect rather than contracts and lawyers. Later they'd file the proper paperwork, but the agreement was made in that handshake and both men knew it was as binding as anything a court could enforce. "You're giving me my home back. You earned it. 5 years of good farming, 5 years of honest work. You rebuilt your life the same way I rebuilt that combine piece by piece with your own hands." That night at supper, Garrett told Lorelei and Wyatt about the sale. The boy was 18 now in the spring of 1986, tall and lean, home from his first year at Iowa State. He'd listened to the story with the intensity of someone trying to memorize important information, so he gets back some of what he lost. Some. Not all, but some. Garrett met his son's eyes across the table. "Remember this. A man's worth isn't measured in how high he climbs. It's measured in how he gets up after he falls." The years between 1986 and 1988 moved with the steady rhythm of seasons. Garrett continued farming his original 320 acres, the land his great-grandfather had broken, his grandfather had cultivated, his father had paid off. He never expanded beyond that. When neighbors asked why he didn't buy more, ground prices were still depressed, land was available, he'd just shake his head. 320 is enough. More than enough. The John Deere 4020 turned over 10,000 hours on its hour meter in the spring of 1988. The tachometer reading was a testament to years of steady work, careful maintenance, and respect for good machinery. But the engine was tired now, burning oil, making noises it hadn't made when new. So that winter, Garrett rebuilt it himself in the barn, pulling the engine out with the same chainfall he'd used on the Massey Ferguson 12 years earlier. He pressed out the pistons, honed the cylinders, replaced the rings and bearings. He had the crankshaft reground at a machine shop in town, paying cash for the work. He rebuilt the fuel injection pump, replaced every gasket, checked every tolerance. It took him 3 months, working evenings and weekends, but when he was done, the engine ran like new. Better than new because he knew every component intimately now. He knew which bearing had the tightest tolerance, which cylinder ran slightly cooler, which valve train needed adjustment every 500 hours. The Farmall M continued doing the lighter work, cultivating, pulling the hay rake, running the old grain auger. Its engine still popped with that same reliable rhythm, the sound of 1951 engineering that had been built to last. Garrett had replaced the rings and valves twice over the years, but the block and crank were original. The tractor was 37 years old and still earning its keep. But it was the Massey Ferguson 510 that had become a local landmark. Every fall when harvest came around, Garrett would fire up that Perkins diesel, and its roar would echo across the valley. Neighbors 2 farms away could hear it, that distinctive hammer-beat idle, the sound of 6 pistons driving 6 rods, the mechanical symphony of controlled combustion. It wasn't the fastest combine in the county. It wasn't the prettiest, with its custom-welded header and patches of primer showing where rust had been cut away and repaired. But people talked about it with a kind of reverence. Farmers would point it out to their sons. "See that combine? Hayes bought that for scrap. $200. Rebuilt it himself when everyone said it was impossible." It became a symbol, a reminder that value wasn't always visible on the surface, that work done right mattered more than shine and chrome, that sometimes the things everyone else overlooked were exactly the things worth saving. On a crisp October afternoon in 1988, Wyatt came home from college for the weekend. He was 20 years old now, studying agricultural business at Iowa State, learning about markets and finance and modern farm management. He'd grown into himself, his grandfather's height, his father's hands, his mother's eyes. He found Garrett in the barn, preparing the Massey Ferguson for soybean harvest, adjusting the cylinder speed and checking the concaves. "Dad, we learned about the farm crisis in class this week. The '80s crash. They talked about leverage and debt-to-asset ratios and cash flow. They made it all sound so complicated." Garrett stopped working and looked at the old combine. The red paint had faded to a soft, mottled orange over 12 years of sun and weather. The machine was covered in dents and welds and patches, each one marking a repair, made a problem solved, a season survived. It looked ancient and tired. But Garrett knew better. Under that weathered exterior was an engine he'd rebuilt with his own hands, a frame he'd straightened and reinforced systems he understood completely. He put his hand on the massive drive wheel, the rubber worn but still solid. "It's not complicated, son. Your grandfather taught me, and I'm teaching you." Wyatt moved closer, giving his father full attention. "Don't ever let a banker own your harvest before it's even in the ground." That was the first rule, the bedrock. Once you take debt on a crop that hasn't been planted yet, you've mortgaged your future to luck and weather in markets. 3 things no man can control. Don't ever bet the farm on the weather or the price of corn, because you can't control either one. The second rule, the hard truth. Markets turned. Droughts came. The only constant was change, and change killed men who'd bet everything on stability. Don't ever buy something you can't pay for and can't fix yourself. The third rule, the practical wisdom that had saved them. If you couldn't afford it and didn't understand it, you didn't own it, it owned you. Garrett patted the combine's dusty flank, leaving a handprint in the accumulated grime of the season. "This old machine taught me the most important lesson of all. It's not about how much you can build, it's about how much you can withstand." He turned to face his son fully. "Strength isn't in the size of your engine, son. It's in the depth of your roots." Wyatt looked at him, then at the combine, and something shifted behind his eyes. Understanding settled there, the kind that couldn't be taught in classrooms or textbooks. He'd watched his father's life, seen the choices made, witnessed the outcomes. He understood now that the pile of iron in front of them wasn't just a machine. It was a story. It was proof. It was a physical manifestation of principles lived out over decades. "I get it." His voice was quiet but certain. "You survived because you were prepared. Not lucky. Prepared. Preparation and fear. I was scared, Wyatt. Scared of debt. Scared of losing what we had, scared of becoming my father's cautionary tale instead of carrying on his legacy. That fear kept me conservative when everyone else was being aggressive. Turned out conservative was the right play." A car door slammed outside. They both looked up to see an old Buick LeSabre pull into the yard, moving slowly. Garrett's mother emerged, moving with the careful deliberation of 80 years. Estelle Hayes had been a widow for 18 years now, living in town but visiting the farm weekly. She walked with a cane but refused any other assistance, her back still straight, her eyes still sharp. Grandma Estelle. Wyatt went to help her up the porch steps, but she waved him off with mock irritation. "I'm old, not helpless." "Old." She made her way to the barn, looking at the combine with an expression that might have been nostalgia or might have been amusement. "Still running, that old beast, I see. Still running." She settled onto a hay bale with a sigh. "I want to tell you something, Wyatt. Something I've never told anyone except your grandfather, and he's been gone 18 years. Both men stopped what they were doing, giving her their complete attention. "In 1932, your great-grandfather and I had $47 to our name. $47, and it was April, planting season. We had a choice: buy seed corn or make the payment to the bank. Couldn't do both." Her eyes grew distant, looking back across more than half a century. "We bought the seed, told the bank we'd pay after harvest. They said they'd foreclose. We said, go ahead. You can't grow corn on a banknote." What happened? They didn't foreclose. They couldn't afford to. They had too much land already that nobody would buy. And they knew deep down, they knew that a family farming was worth more than empty ground. So they waited. We planted that seed, worked that ground, brought in the crop, and 3 years later we'd paid them back in full. She looked at Wyatt directly. You come from survivors, not because we were lucky, because we were stubborn, and because we loved each other more than we feared them. The words settled over the barn like a blessing. That December, Estelle passed away quietly in her sleep. At her funeral, the church was packed. 3 generations of people she'd taught and influenced and helped over 80 years. The pastor spoke about resilience and faith and the quiet strength of women who held families together through depression and war and disaster. He quoted her final words to Wyatt about surviving through stubbornness and love. More than a few people cried. They buried her next to Garrett's father in the cemetery on the hill overlooking the farm. The land she'd helped save in 1932 stretched out below, still in the family, still producing, still free. Spring came early in 1989. By March, the ground was workable. One Saturday morning, Garrett and Dalton drove together to an auction. A young farmer was losing his place, different reasons than the '80s crash, but the same result. The farmyard looked eerily familiar. The defeated posture of the family, the sparse crowd, the equipment selling for less than it was worth. The farmer was maybe 30, his wife younger, a baby on her hip. We should help. Dalton's voice was quiet. Garrett looked at him, seeing the reflection of that April day 8 years ago. What are you thinking? We bid on some equipment, not to keep, to rent back to him, give him a chance to rebuild. They bid carefully, strategically, a used planter that went too cheap, a grain drill, a good used tractor. They won the bids and immediately approached the young farmer. We're going to rent this equipment back to you. Dalton's voice was kind but firm. Same terms as a lease purchase. You farm with it, make payments you can afford, and in a few years it's yours. The young man looked between them, confused and hopeful and terrified all at once. Why would you do that? Because someone did it for me once. Dalton glanced at Garrett. Because that's what neighbors do. Wyatt had come with them home for spring break. He stood watching the whole transaction, seeing his father and Dalton work together to save someone else the way Garrett had saved Dalton. The lesson was being passed forward, the cycle continuing. Over the following months, the young farmer worked the equipment, made his modest payments, and slowly rebuilt. Dalton checked in on him regularly, offering advice, helping with repairs, becoming a mentor the way Garrett had mentored Dalton. The circle widened, the principles spreading to another generation. By the time harvest came around that fall, Garrett was 56 years old. His back hurt more than it used to. His hands were stiff in the mornings. But when he climbed into the Massey Ferguson and fired up that Perkins diesel, he felt 20 years younger. The roar still sent a thrill through his chest, the sound of survival, the music of stubborn persistence. Wyatt had graduated that spring and come home to farm. He worked alongside his father now, learning the rhythms of the land, the personality of each piece of equipment, the judgment calls that separated good farmers from failed ones. They worked the same 320 acres using the same machinery, following the same principles. One evening in October, after a long day of combining soybeans, they stood together by the barn. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. The Massey Ferguson sat quiet after its day's work, dust and chaff still clinging to it. When you take over, what are you going to do with it? Wyatt didn't hesitate. Keep it running. Same as you. Same as Grandpa kept the farm all running. Why? Because it's not about nostalgia. It's not about being stubborn for stubborn's sake. His voice carried certainty. It's about remembering. Remembering that value isn't always visible. Remembering that work done right matters. Remembering that the things everyone overlooks are sometimes exactly the things worth saving. Garrett felt something in his chest expand and release. His son understood. Not just intellectually, but deeply in the way that mattered. The lesson had taken root. The land stretched around them to the horizon, every acre paid for, every inch free and clear. The soil was the same black Iowa dirt his great-grandfather had broken with mules, the same ground that had fed 4 generations of their family. Dalton farmed the home place, now the 120 acres he'd earned back 80 on a $1 a year lease, 40 he'd bought back with cash. He'd never be the empire builder he'd once dreamed of becoming, but he'd become something better, a man who knew the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. The Massey Ferguson had outlasted so many newer machines. 13 harvests since Garrett bought it for scrap, thousands of acres cut. And it was still going. He'd replaced parts, made repairs, adapted and improved, but the core was the same that Perkins diesel he'd rebuilt in a cold barn while everyone said he was wasting his time. On this October evening, with the sun setting and harvest nearly complete, Garrett stood with his son and knew something with absolute certainty. True wealth wasn't what you owned. It was what you could withstand, what you could give when others needed it, what you could hold on to when the world tried to take it away. In the distance, the FarmLife popped to life, Wyatt starting it for evening chores. The sound was steady, reliable, eternal. The same sound his great-grandfather had heard in 1951. The same sound that would echo across this land as long as there were Hayes working it. And in that sound was everything worth knowing about survival and dignity and the quiet victory of simply enduring. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October 2009 while Wyatt was combining the North 40. His cell phone, a concession to modern farming that his father still refused to carry, vibrated in his shirt pocket. The hospital in Des Moines. Garrett had collapsed in the waiting room during his routine checkup. They were running tests. Wyatt shut down the combine mid-row and drove the 20 miles to the hospital, doing 70 on roads posted for 55. He found his father in a bed that looked too small for him, hooked to machines that beeped and hummed. Lorelei sat in the chair beside him, her hand wrapped around Garrett's, her face composed but her eyes telling a different story. Heart attack. Small one. The doctor was younger than Wyatt, speaking in careful tones. He's stable now, but at 76, with the stress his body's been under for decades of farm work, we need to talk about lifestyle changes. Garrett's eyes were closed, but Wyatt could tell he was listening. Could see the slight tightening around his mouth that meant he was angry at his own weakness. That evening, after the doctors had left and Lorelei had gone to call relatives, Garrett opened his eyes and looked at his son. The combine. You left it in the field. It can wait. Nothing waits on a farm. You know that. Garrett's voice was rough, diminished. Get back there. Finish the field. I'll still be here tomorrow. Wyatt wanted to argue but recognized the look on his father's face. It was the same expression he'd worn 33 years ago when he'd bid $200 on a pile of scrap. Determined, stubborn, refusing to let circumstances dictate terms. So Wyatt drove back to the farm in the dark and climbed into the combine by the light of its work lamps. He finished the North 40, then started on the east field, working until past midnight. Not because the soybeans couldn't wait, but because his father needed to know that the work continued, that the land was still being tended, that the principles were holding. Garrett came home 3 days later with a list of restrictions that read like a death sentence to a farmer. No heavy lifting, no climbing into tractor cabs, limited time in the cold, reduced stress. The doctor might as well have told him to stop breathing, but something had shifted. Wyatt saw it the first morning his father stood on the porch watching him head out to the fields instead of coming along. Saw it in the way Garrett touched the FarmLife's fender as he walked past, a gesture almost like goodbye. That winter, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread between them, Garrett spoke words Wyatt had been expecting but dreading. I need to make it official. Transfer the deed. You've been running this place for 3 years already. Time to make it yours on paper. Wyatt looked at the documents, the same land, the same 320 acres passing from father to son, the way it had 4 times before. I'm not ready. Nobody ever is. Garrett's smile was small. I wasn't ready when Dad died. He wasn't ready when his father passed. But the land doesn't care about our readiness. It just needs someone who'll care for it. They signed the papers in February 2010 with Lorelei as witness. Garrett Hayes transferred the farm he'd inherited at 32 to his son, who was now 42. The same age Garrett had been when he bought the Massey Ferguson. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of them, but Wyatt insisted on one addition to the transfer. A clause written in his own hand at the bottom of the legal document, Garrett Hayes retains lifetime residency and decision-making authority on all matters pertaining to equipment, land management, and farm philosophy. Effective owner may not borrow against this property without written consent of Garrett Hayes. His father read it twice, then looked up with something like wonder. "You're protecting me from you." "I'm protecting us from temptation." Wyatt met his eyes. "Land values are climbing again. Banks are calling offering operating loans at good rates. And I've got 2 kids heading to college. The pressure's there, Dad. I need you to be the voice that says no when I get weak." Garrett signed below Wyatt's clause without another word. The spring of 2010 brought another change that felt seismic. Dalton Brennan, now 62 years old, finally bought back the last 80 acres of his home place. 29 years after the auction, he'd saved enough from his repair business to pay cash for the land Garrett had been renting to him for $1 a year. They met at the same kitchen table where so many farm decisions had been made. Dalton counted out $100 bills in stacks, $80,000, all of it earned with wrenches and patience and the slow accumulation of work done right. "It's worth more than this." Garrett pushed the money back slightly. "Market rate is at least 95. "I know what it's worth." Dalton's hands stayed on the cash. "But this is what I've got, and I'm asking you to take it, because I need to own this free and clear. No bank, no debt, the way you taught me." Garrett looked at this man who'd once mocked him, who'd lost everything, who'd spent 3 decades rebuilding himself into someone stronger than he'd ever been in prosperity. "All right, 80 it is." After Dalton left, Lorelei came into the kitchen and found Garrett staring at the stacks of bills. 29 years. She sat down across from him. "That's how long it took him to buy back what took 5 years to lose." "No." Garrett shook his head. 5 years to lose the land. 29 years to buy back his dignity. The land's just a symbol. In June of that year, the Henderson County Historical Society contacted Wyatt with a request that seemed absurd at first. They wanted the Massey Ferguson 510, not to scrap or sell, but to preserve. They were creating an exhibit on the farm crisis and its aftermath, and they wanted the combine as the centerpiece, the machine that symbolized survival through the crash. Wyatt brought the proposal to his father. Garrett was sitting on the porch watching storm clouds build in the west the way he'd done for 76 years. "I'm not dead yet. The combine's not retired. Dad, it's 34 years old. We've got that newer John Deere now. This one just sits in the barn most seasons. It runs. I know it runs. But maybe it's time to let it mean something bigger than just our farm." Garrett was quiet for a long time, watching the lightning flicker in the distance. Finally, what would they do with it? Clean it up? Restore it some? Put it in the agricultural museum? There'd be a plaque telling the story how you bought it for scrap, rebuilt it, ran it for decades. How it became a symbol. A symbol of what? Of doing things right when everyone else was doing them wrong. Of patience. Of seeing value where others saw junk. Garrett's jaw worked. "They'll get it wrong. Make me sound like some kind of hero. I was just scared. Just trying to survive." "Maybe that's the heroism." Wyatt pulled up a chair. "Being scared but doing it anyway." The storm was closer now, the wind picking up, carrying the smell of rain. Garrett closed his eyes. "All right. But on one condition. We drive it there ourselves. Under its own power. I want people to see it's not just a museum piece. It's a working machine we're choosing to retire." The day they delivered the combine to the museum was hot and clear, late August 2010. Wyatt drove the semi with the Massey Ferguson chained on the flatbed trailer. But first they'd driven it the 8 miles from the farm to town, Garrett in the operator's seat, Wyatt following in the pickup. Just like hauling it home 34 years earlier, except this time people didn't stare with mockery. They stopped what they were doing and waved. At the museum, a small crowd had gathered. Local farmers, some reporters, a few historical society members. The curator, a woman in her 50s who'd grown up on a farm herself, shook Garrett's hand with both of hers. "This means more than you know. We've interviewed 17 families who lost their farms in the 80s. Yours is the only story we have of someone who made it through intact. We weren't the only ones. No. But you're the only one who turned around and helped others through it. That's what makes this story worth preserving." They unveiled the plaque that afternoon. Bronze mounted on oak. Massey Ferguson, 510 combine. Purchased 1976 for $200 as scrap. Rebuilt. 1976 to 1977 by Garrett Hayes. In service, 1977 to 2009, harvested over 250,000 bushels, symbol of resilience through the 1980s farm crisis. Strength isn't in the size of your engine, it's in the depth of your roots. Garrett Hayes to his son, 1988. Garrett read it 3 times, then turned away. His shoulders were shaking. Lorelei stepped beside him and took his arm, and only then did Wyatt realize his father was crying. 76 years old, and Wyatt had never seen him cry before. "I was just scared." Garrett's voice was barely audible. Just a scared man trying not to lose what his father left him. "And you didn't lose it." Lorelei's voice was fierce. "And then you gave it to others so they wouldn't lose theirs." "That's not fear, Garrett. That's love." The museum opened the exhibit in September. Within a month, over 3,000 people had visited. Farmers brought their children and grandchildren to see the combine, to read the story, to understand that the choices their parents and grandparents had made to stay small, to avoid debt, to repair rather than replace, hadn't been backward. They'd been wise. But it was a letter that arrived in October that showed Wyatt how far the ripples had spread. It was from a young farmer in Missouri, a woman he'd never met. "Dear Mr. Hayes, I visited your father's combine at the museum last week. I'm 28, trying to start farming with my husband, and everyone tells us we need to borrow $300,000 for equipment or we'll never make it. We were about to sign the loan papers. Then I read the plaque. And I thought, what if we don't? What if we start small, buy used, learn to fix things ourselves? What if we give ourselves the gift your father gave himself, the freedom to fail without losing everything? We're not signing. We're buying a used tractor for cash instead. I thought your father should know his story is still saving farms, still saving families." Jennifer Kowalski, Miller County, Missouri. Wyatt brought the letter to his father that evening. Garrett read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket over his heart. That's worth more than the combine ever was. By the fall of 2011, Garrett's health had deteriorated to where he spent most days in the house. But on good days, he'd walk out to the machine shed and sit in the old wooden chair he'd dragged there decades ago, watching Wyatt work. His hands would move sometimes phantom motions of adjusting a wrench or threading a bolt muscle memory from 10,000 repairs. Wyatt's children. Emma, 16, and Jack, 14, had grown up hearing the stories. But it was Emma who seemed to carry the same stubborn practicality that had defined her grandfather. She'd started a business her freshman year, buying broken lawnmowers at garage sales, fixing them with YouTube tutorials and tools borrowed from Dalton, then reselling them for profit. By 16, she had $4,000 saved. One Saturday in October, she came to Wyatt with a proposal. "Grandpa taught you to rebuild engines. You need to teach me. I want to learn on something real." They started with the 1951 FarmLife. 60 years old now, still running but tired. Wyatt and Emma spent that winter in the shop, the same shop where Garrett had rebuilt the Massey Ferguson's engine 4 decades earlier, taking the farm all apart piece by piece. Garrett would come out some evenings bundled in a heavy coat and watch from his chair. He didn't offer much advice. His hands shook too much now to demonstrate anything. His breath came too short to explain for long. But his presence was instruction enough. Emma learned the same lessons Wyatt had learned, that Garrett had learned, that stretched back generations. That patience mattered more than power. That understanding how something worked was more valuable than buying something new. That fixing what was broken was an act of faith, faith that the old ways still had worth. That quality endured, that work done right created value that couldn't be measured in dollars. When they fired up the FarmLife in March 2012, its engine popping with that same reliable rhythm it had made for 61 years, Emma stood in the shop doorway with grease-black hands and tears running clean tracks down her cheeks. "I get it now. Why Grandpa kept everything. Why you do. It's not about the machines at all." "No." Wyatt put an arm around her shoulders. "It's about knowing you can survive. Knowing you've got the skills and the tools and the understanding to make things work when everyone else is saying they can't be fixed." Garrett died in his sleep on a Sunday morning in April 2013, 2 weeks before his 80th birthday. The funeral was packed standing room only in a church that seated 300. Farmers came from 6 counties. The current generation middle-aged now who remembered him as a stubborn man with old equipment. The older generation his contemporaries who remembered the auction and the years of mockery that preceded his vindication. And the young ones who only knew him through stories but understood those stories had saved their family farms. Dalton Brennan gave the eulogy, his voice strong despite his 75 years. He talked about pride and fall and grace, about a man who could have gloated but chose mercy, about lessons learned not through words but through example. Garrett Hayes taught me that a man isn't defined by his success. He's defined by what he does when he fails, and what he does when someone else fails. Dalton looked at the crowd. I failed, spectacularly, lost everything I'd built, and this man, he could have let me drown, could have bought my land cheap and let me disappear. Instead, he threw me a rope, and then he taught me how to swim. They buried Garrett on the hill next to Lorelei's parents, overlooking the 320 acres he'd never mortgaged, never lost, never let slip from the family. The same land his great-grandfather had broken, the same soil his grandfather had cultivated through depression and war, the same fields his father had paid off with decades of careful work. At the graveside, Wyatt stood with his arm around Emma Jack beside them. 3 generations present, one just departed, one stretching back into memory. The continuity of it, the unbroken chain of people who'd worked this land, loved it, protected it, felt both fragile and eternal. That evening, the family gathered at the farmhouse. Relatives. Wyatt barely knew neighbors who'd become family, and Dalton with his wife Charlene, still together after 60 years of marriage that had survived bankruptcy and shame and rebuilding. They told stories about Garrett's stubbornness, about the combine that became legend, about the winter he spent alone in the barn while everyone thought he was crazy, about the auction where he bought back a man's dignity along with his land. But it was Emma who asked the question that had been building all day. Grandpa saved money for decades. He died with almost $1 million in the bank. Why didn't he ever spend it? Why did he keep living like he was poor? The room went quiet. Everyone looked at Wyatt. He took a breath, choosing his words carefully. He wasn't poor, and he wasn't hoarding money. He was hoarding freedom. Every dollar he didn't spend was a dollar that couldn't be taken away. Every debt he didn't take was a chain he didn't have to wear. He remembered what it felt like to be scared, really scared of losing everything. And he never wanted to feel that way again. So he died rich. Jack's voice carried genuine confusion. No. Wyatt shook his head. He died free. There's a difference. Later that night, after everyone had left, Wyatt walked out to the machine shed. The Farmall M sat there freshly rebuilt, ready for another decade of work. The John Deere 4020, now 44 years old, its engine rebuilt twice. The newer equipment they'd bought over the years, all paid for in cash, none of it financed. And in the corner, empty now, the space where the Massey Ferguson had sat for 33 years before going to the museum. Wyatt could still picture it there, rusty, patched, ugly to anyone who didn't know its story. Beautiful to anyone who did. His phone buzzed. A text from the museum curator. Attendance doubled this week. Everyone wants to see the tractor that survived. Thought you should know. Wyatt typed back, it's a combine, and it didn't survive. My father did. But even as he sent it, he knew that wasn't quite true either. The machine and the man and the principle they represented, they'd all survived together. 320 acres debt-free since 1954. One family unbroken through 4 generations. One story powerful enough to change lives decades after the events it described. Emma appeared in the shed doorway. Dad, you okay? Wyatt nodded. Just thinking about what we're going to tell the next generation, what we're going to teach your kids someday. Same thing Grandpa taught you. Don't borrow what you can't repay. Don't buy what you can't fix. Don't bet everything on things you can't control. That's the what. But what about the why? Emma came to stand beside him, looking at the empty space where the combine had been. Because the world's going to keep offering us easy money and fast growth and new shiny things that make us feel rich. And we need to remember that none of that matters if we lose our freedom in the process. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Spring storms moving across Iowa, bringing the rain that would make the corn grow, continuing the cycle that had sustained this land for over a century and a half. Somewhere in a museum in town under careful lights and behind velvet ropes, a rusty old combine sat with a bronze plaque explaining its significance. Thousands would see it, read the story, carry the lesson forward. But here on the farm, in an old machine shed that smelled of grease and earth and time, the real legacy was simpler and deeper. It was knowing the difference between what you owned and what owned you. It was understanding that size mattered less than survival. It was learning to see value in things everyone else overlooked. It was the sound of an old Farmall M starting up on a spring morning, its engine popping the same rhythm it had made for 62 years. A sound that said, "We're still here, still working, still free." And in that sound was every lesson Garrett Hayes had ever taught, every principle he'd ever lived, every choice he'd ever made. Not preserved in bronze or displayed behind glass, but alive and working and passing from generation to generation like the land itself. That was the harvest that would never end.